Good morning. Welcome to Aletheia Church. I'm glad to have you with us here this morning. My name is Kevin. I'm one of the pastors here at the church. If this is your first time, we're glad to have you with us. Parents of elementary school age kids, if you wanted to send your kids off to Aletheia Junior for their time, you can go ahead and dismiss them to the back. Their teachers will be back there. For the rest of you guys, go ahead and turn over to John chapter 19. That's where we're going to be this morning. If you have not yet gotten a scripture journal and you would like one, just raise your hand. And one of our volunteers would love to bring one of those to you. It's a free gift to you. We've been studying John's gospel together now since last year, and would love for you to be able to just have that. All it is the Gospel of John on one side of the journal, and on the other side is just a place to take notes. And we've been taking notes together because really, as we study books of the Bible here, our desire is that we would more deeply know and understand God's word holistically, because we believe it is how God primarily speaks to us, is through the reading and proclamation of the scriptures. And so our text this morning in John chapter 19, as you just heard it read to you, is a continuation of what we saw last week, where we saw Jesus being taken to Pontius Pilate. And if you didn't get a chance and you weren't here last week, I would highly recommend you go back and listen to the sermon from last week, because it's going to play a lot into what we're talking about this morning. I might even reference it a few times. But it's really, really important in understanding that at this point in the narrative of the Passion Week and Jesus' crucifixion, last week we saw the council, or the Sanhedrin as they're formally known, take Jesus to Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman governor or magistrate for this particular region, to deliver him over in hopes that they would crucify him. Now, throughout that story last week, I pointed out to us that there were three separate threads that we could see from the various groups that were interacting in that story outside of Jesus himself. And we said that it was really, really important because the individual things that each group was kind of struggling with tend to be things that even today, some 2,000 years later, the human race really, really struggles with. And so the first group, the group that took Jesus to Pontius Pilate, the council, the Sanhedrin, they struggled, or they looked to find their truth in their own self-righteousness. They were abundantly convinced of their own understanding, interpretation of the Old Testament scriptures. They were abundantly convinced that they could live a life that was morally good enough and that it would make them acceptable towards God. They kind of had even an attitude of smugness about them, of how much better they were than everyone else, because they knew and understood the scriptures at a higher rate than your average person. And so they struggle with this idea of self-righteousness, and Jesus is a real threat to this, because Jesus had said, even at one point during the gospel accounts, that unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees and the scribes, that you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. Basically, damning them and anyone else who's listening to the words that he's preaching that morning, that they're heading to hell. And so Jesus wasn't exactly popular with the religious leaders of the day, because he challenged the status quo. He challenged their belief system and said that God was never going to find their lives to measure up with the holiness and perfection that he demanded of his creation. And so in their struggle to find their own truth and their self-righteousness, they send Jesus to Pilate, hoping to have him killed. Now, when you get to Pilate, you find a completely different set of circumstances. And each one of these groups of people is going to reject Jesus and the truth that he's presenting, but Pilate's is very different. He does not care about religion. He does not care about the Jewish history or the heritage at all. He only cares about power and control. And we saw, as he was there trying to deal with this situation, that he's wrestling for power and he's wrestling for control, trying to make sure that he can appease everyone and just make the perfect decision somewhere along the way so that he can do the right thing. And then lastly, we found the crowd of the Jews who found their truth or their hope in their social identity, or in their national identity or unity as a people. And what we see in each of those groups is that they had the opportunity to hear the words of Jesus, to sit underneath the teaching of Jesus, to hear that he was sent by the Father to free them from the very things they had enslaved themselves to listen and respond to this revelation, but none of them do. because they have trusted in something else. And each of the places that they place their trust will ultimately end up failing them. We're going to see the ultimate failure of the Sanhedrin this morning. We noticed even Pilate losing his control. And if you know anything about Jewish history, it would be less than 40 years that Rome would come in and destroy the temple and fully set Israel to be scattered out into the diaspora. And so when we get to our portion of our text this morning, we're coming to the end of Jesus' trial before Pontius Pilate. And although Jesus speaks very little in our text this morning, his interaction with Pilate and the Jews is going to reveal some of the final truths about who he is. That we're going to see in our text this morning that the Father, one final time in this interaction, is going to fully display the character, nature, and truth of who Jesus of Nazareth truly is. We're going to see Jesus revealed in glory before Pilate and before his accusers in a way that you might not normally realize as you read this story. And so 3 things I want us to see this morning as we move through this text. The first one is this. We're going to see Jesus as the suffering servant and why that matters. We're going to see that Jesus has all authority. And then we're going to see that Jesus is worthy of our worship. So let's head over to chapter 19, and I want us to just look at the first 6 verses as we unpack this idea of Jesus as the suffering servant. It says, "Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews!' and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, 'See, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no guilt in him.' So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, 'Behold, the man.' When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, 'Crucify him! Crucify him!' But Pilate said to them, 'Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him.'" Now, I want to just pause there for a moment and unpack a little bit some of the things that we see there, because there's a lot going on that you may or may not fully realize, especially in regards to Old Testament prophecies and things that had been promised about the Messiah who God would send. So Pilate, in his attempts to keep order, in his attempts to exercise judgment but not totally give in to the Jews, he's kind of been coming up with various ideas to not crucify Jesus, because he realizes that ultimately Jesus is being brought to him over a theological issue that he doesn't really care about. So as Jesus has been brought before him, we noticed last week that the crowd had foiled his plan, because what Pilate had done is he says, "Well, I find no fault in this guy, and it's the Passover festival week, and I have a tradition during this festival to place a criminal in front of you and allow you to pick this criminal to be released to you." And so he picks Jesus and he picks Barabbas to stand before the crowd. And if you don't know anything about them, I mentioned last week, Barabbas was an insurrectionist. He was someone that had led a charge against Rome. He was a murderer. He was very much a threat to Roman rule in Israel. And so Pilate thinks, oh, well, this guy's a murderer. Clearly, they're going to choose to keep this guy imprisoned and sent to crucifixion, and they'll let Jesus go because this guy hasn't done anything. He's really done absolutely nothing worthy of the penalty. And so he brings them before the crowd, and not surprisingly, the crowd responds to free Barabbas and to kill Jesus. And so Pilate moves forward, as we're moving into chapter 19, to develop a new strategy to get out of having to kill Jesus. And before I go any further, we need to understand that it's not for altruistic or religious reasons that Pilate's doing this. He doesn't want to get involved in a Jewish theological issue. He has the responsibility of exercising judgment and keeping the peace in the region. And he can see no fault in Jesus because this is a theological issue for the Jews that he does not care about, but he doesn't want to lose control of the ruling class, which is the Sanhedrin, so he wants to appease them, but he also understands that there are a large number of people in the region that were going out to Jesus and following his teachings. He would have been fully aware of it, and so he knows, hey, I'm kind of backed into a corner here. I have one mob that wants to kill him and another mob that really likes him. I'm kind of stuck here. What do I do? And so it's not because he has this strong sense of what is right and wrong and what is just. It's because he's backed into a corner politically and he doesn't want to lose power and control. And so as he sits through and is thinking through this, he comes up with a new strategy. And he thinks to himself, okay, these guys are telling me he's a king. They're worried about losing power to him. I know what I'll do. And so he has Jesus flogged. And flogging in Roman culture would take three separate forms. The first one was a less severe beating for minor offenses. So, hear me on this. It still was bad, but it was a less severe form of punishment, right? Then there was a second level, which was a brutal flogging for severe offenses, to where sometimes you might even have like a hand cut off or whatever that may be for stealing or whatever else it may be, but it was a more severe form of flogging. And then there was a third form of flogging, which was only done prior to crucifixion. This was like when you hear the word scourge being used to describe what Jesus went through. They only did this type of beating prior to crucifixion. And what they would do is they would take whips and they would either put bones on the end of them or something else that would really sharpen. When they would whip, it would dig into the skin and then rip it out. It would often break bones. And the point of that was to beat down the body before the crucifixion so that the crucifixion wouldn't last as long. Romans had become masters of execution at this point, and so their goal was to quicken these things up, because sometimes someone would hang on the cross for a couple of days and you have to have people out there to watch it, and they had decided they didn't like that anymore, so they had devised some other strategies to quicken the pace so that whoever was being executed would die more quickly. And if you're familiar with the other gospel accounts, they only tend to talk about the third type of flogging that Jesus received before his crucifixion. But actually what we see here in John's gospel is that it's very, very likely that Jesus actually faced two separate floggings. One was this less severe form of flogging, and then the second one would have been before he went to the cross. And this less severe flogging that Jesus receives here is shown to us in these first couple of verses, where Pilate hands Jesus over to Roman guards to beat him. They place a crown of thorns on his head. They put purple robes on him to mock him. They yell to him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews," and beat him mercilessly. And there is a reason why Pilate chooses to do this. Look at verses 4 and 5 with me. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Behold, the man." Now you may be sitting there wondering, what is going on here? And here's what I think Pilate is trying to do. Pilate, in his attempt to keep and play the political game and to keep power and control and always make the right decision and have everyone be appeased so he can continue to keep rule in the region. He doesn't want to kill Jesus, but he knows the crowd is angry, so he thinks to himself, okay, if I can present Jesus to the crowd and the council as a beaten and pathetic man, and he will be seen then by them as no threat to their power. And if they see him as no threat, maybe they'll back off. Maybe they'll back off from this desire to have him crucified if I just show how weak he is. In some ways, as he brings Jesus out, who's been beaten and has this crown of thorns on his head, he's in the purple robes to kind of show or signify that he is royalty on some level. They bring him out before the crowd, and in some ways, Pilate is mocking the crowd here. Right? He looks out to them and says, "Behold the man." It's basically saying to them, look how beaten he is. Look how weak he is. This is the guy you're worried about? This is the guy you're bringing to me over a theological issue about whether he's the king of the Jews or not? This is the one that you're worried is going to unseat your power and authority? And so we have this juxtaposition in the text and in the storyline here where the leaders are attempting to do everything they can to mock and humiliate and make Jesus look weak. And yet, the reality is that Jesus, in this lowly moment, saying nothing at all, is displaying his glory to all who are present as the one and only suffering servant and son of the Father. Turn over to Isaiah 53 with me, and I know that you guys heard this as the call to worship if you made it to that portion of the service this morning. But in Isaiah 53, this is the prophet Isaiah talking about the coming Messiah who would rescue and redeem God's people. If you had grown up Jewish, you would have understood that this verse was looking forward to a time where God would liberate his people. And Isaiah 53 is referring to and talking about who this person is and what he will look like. And look at what he says here. He says, "Who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that is before its shearers silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living? Stricken for the transgression of my people. And they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors, yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but when I read that passage, all I can see is what we read out of John chapter 19. It says he was despised. This man was going to be despised. He was going to be pierced and crushed for our iniquities. That he would be oppressed and afflicted, yet not open his mouth. by oppression and judgment, he would be taken away. That he had done no violence and that there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet, Isaiah says that it was God's will to do this to this suffering servant so that his soul might make an offering for our guilt. That through him, many would be accounted righteous. And that he would bear the sin of many. Friends, as Jesus stands there before the crowd with the crown of thorns on his head, and as he wears these robes after he's been beaten, he is fully fulfilling the promise that God made to his people of the Messiah coming to save them and rescue them. In a moment where he does not talk at all, the full revelation of who Jesus is being done before this crowd. He's giving no defense. He's making no arguments. He's simply doing what the Father sent him to do. He is the full fulfillment of the promises of the Son of God. And as they seek to crucify him, he walks in step with the Father's plan for your sake and for mine. And for the very crowd that is sending him to his execution. I mean, just ponder that for a minute. We tend to trust weathermen and they get their predictions correct what percentage of the time? Like 15? Right, just yesterday, right, my son was invited to a birthday party that could not occur if the weather was happening. And do you know how many times we watched that weather forecast yesterday morning and how many times it changed? At least 15. Like the rain's going to start at 9. Actually, it's going to start at 10. Actually, it's going to start at 11, but there's going to be a little drizzle. But the heavy stuff's not coming until noon. Actually, it's happening at 1. Right, we just kept running back to our phone looking for things. And of course, I'm a Gentile. I have an Android device, so it was different than my wife's iPhone. The Lord loves the Gentiles as well, Android users. God still loves us. You keep sending those group texts out in the iMessage. It's fine. The Lord will endure. But we run to these places, and when we see these forecasts, we think, oh, this is so great. And yet, look at Isaiah 53. Hundreds of years before Jesus walks the earth. And then look what Jesus did with his life. Friends, there's a reason why we talk about prophecies of the Messiah being so important, because they're validation that we don't just believe that this first century carpenter might have been a good guy to follow. No, it's because he's God's Son fully revealed in the flesh. And the power that contains is something that radically transforms lives. As he stands there silently, we saw the week before in our text last week that when Pilate's questioning him and asks him if he's a king, Jesus says, yes, I am a king, but not of this world. And if I was a king of this world, you would not be able to detain me right now. But in his strength and in his power and in his obedience to his Father to fulfill the will to do what he was sent to do, he stands there silently as the suffering servant that God had promised his people all along. He's not just some good teacher. He's not just some moral rabbi who came to teach some good philosophies. He's the Son of God in the flesh who came to die for the sins of the world. And as he stands there, and as Pilate's trying to find a way to continue that control problem he's got, the crowd sees right through Pilate's plan. They do not care. They don't care that Jesus has been humiliated. They continue to yell, crucify him, crucify him. And Pilate continues to argue with them and says, no, you crucify him. And as they argue over what to do with him, what we're going to see is not only is Jesus the suffering servant, but he stands there quietly in full authority. Right, look at verses 7 through 11 with me. The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" And Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." Now, this interaction actually might seem a little odd to you. But let me try to explain and kind of break down what's going on here. So, the Jews are ultimately claiming that Jesus is worthy of death, even according to the law, because they're claiming that Jesus has committed blasphemy by making himself out to be God. That's what they're saying. They're saying, hey, when we first brought him to you, we knew you didn't care about Jewish theology, and so we also wanted to let you know that he's made himself out to be king of the Jews, and we know that that is against Roman rule and Roman law, so we presented him to you in that way. And so, but you're trying to hand him back over to us and telling us that he's not worthy of death. But we're telling you that according to our law, he is worthy of death. He's committed blasphemy. Unless he's actually the Son of God. Keep that in mind. That he's actually worthy of death. And so, as they're arguing back and forth, the argument to Pilate is kind of like this. Hey, you need to crucify him because you aren't just responsible for keeping the peace in this region, but maintaining local law as well. You're responsible for keeping Roman law first and foremost, but you are also responsible for enforcing our own laws. That's how occupation or colonialization worked in Rome, that as long as a law didn't directly contradict the laws of Rome, that whoever the counselor or governor was in that region, they actually oversaw the enforcement of local law as well. And so the council is saying to Pilate, hey, under Roman law, he's worthy of death, and under Jewish law, he's worthy of death. You need to crucify him. Because we can't kill him, and you know this, you have to be the one to do it. Now it says this, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. Now, there's two possibilities here of why Pilate is so scared at this point, and I think there's a possibility that both of them are true. Right? The first one is this. He knows how serious the Jews are about making sure that Jesus is crucified and that there is truth to what they're saying, and so he's going to be backed into a corner and he's going to be forced to do this even though he doesn't want to. And just remember, if he crucifies Jesus, I said this earlier, there's going to be some people who are upset about this in the region, but number two, he's going to look weak because it's going to make it look like he did exactly what these people told him to do, and he doesn't want to do that. He wants to show that he has complete power, control, and authority. Now, the second reason is what they've just got done saying about him. Right? Remember that he had this conversation with Jesus, and Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If it was, I would have already been released. There would be fighting going on. And then he brings him back out to the crowd, and the crowd says, hey, he's called himself God. He's saying that he has divine origins. And if you know anything about Romans, they kind of were like interesting in the way they interacted with religion. They had a pantheon of gods that they claimed to believe in, closely related to Greek mythology, but it kind of really wasn't that big of a deal. But they did have superstitions regarding like divine authority and where people might derive that power from. And so Jesus is now being called in some ways to Pilate a holy man. And he probably would not have viewed Jesus as being from God himself, the way that the Jews are claiming, but he's still some sort of divine man, clearly, if the Jews are worried about him, And this would then cause him to be worried because they were extremely superstitious about how they interacted with these types of people. And if you don't believe me, go over to Matthew chapter 27 real quick. Pilate's own wife in this gospel is recorded as giving him a warning in regards to Jesus. Look at what she says in verse 19. Besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today." So here he has this already kind of preconceived idea of who Jesus is, of who holy men were to be, and his wife sent warning, and so now he's a little nervous over what's going on here. And so Pilate takes Jesus back into his headquarters and immediately says to him, "Hey, where are you from?" And Jesus refuses to answer once again. The suffering servant continues just to keep his mouth shut. And so Pilate throws the equivalent of an adult temper tantrum and says, "How dare you not answer me when your life hangs in the balance?" I mean, and part of this is because he's in full fear. Remember, he's losing control of the situation, and he knows it. He knows the crowd is going to force him into doing something he doesn't want to do. He knows that Caesar's likely not going to like that this is all going down. He's losing control, and here he has a potentially divine holy man standing in front of him. And we see Jesus' authority on full display in his response. Look at what he says in verse 11. Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." Here Jesus knows he is walking to his execution. He's just been beaten by this guy. He's been mocked, humiliated. And yet look at how he speaks to this guy. He says, "Your authority was given to you by my heavenly Father." This entire situation, this farce of a trial, the nonsense I got put through last night after my arrest, the beating I just suffered at the hands of your guards, every single bit of it is 100% in the control of my heavenly Father, and any authority you think you have in this situation was given to you by him. As a matter of fact, everything that's going on here, all who are involved are operating under ultimately the final will of God. My Father wants this to go down this way. And theologians refer to this idea as concurrence. It's where God works in and through the evil actions of sinful men and women to accomplish his purposes. And this isn't the only place you see this. I mean, for one example, go back to Genesis chapter 50. Right, if you're familiar with the story of Joseph, right, Joseph has these dreams where he claims his brothers are going to bow down and worship him, and then he's bold enough to share those dreams with his brothers and his father, and so they get mad at him, they don't like him, and so they sell him into slavery in Egypt, and after some time in Egypt, eventually Joseph works his way up to being like second in command inside of Egypt. He's basically rescued Egypt from famine. God's people, Joseph's father and his family, are struggling and about to die from the famine in their own region. And so guess where they go to get food? Egypt. And when they show up down there, right, Joseph ends up helping them and preserving them. And look at what Joseph says to his brothers as he talks to them in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. He says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." Yeah, you guys didn't have the foresight to send me down here because you knew that I would be able to do this. You didn't send me down to Egypt because you wanted to ultimately preserve God's people, but God knew what you were doing, and he used it to preserve our line anyway because of God's promise to Abraham. God can and does use the wicked actions of man to bring a greater purpose of good. And this does not mean that Pilate doesn't hold guilt for what he's doing in this whole charade. He clearly refuses to lead the way he's supposed to. Much less so, as Jesus says there, the group that turned him over to Pilate in the first place. They are still guilty of their actions, but God is 100% in control. And I want you to think deeply about this for just a minute. Because if God is fully in control of this situation, it means he's fully in control in every situation that we might face. Jesus is going to the cross with complete authority and control over what's happening. And I think so often we as humans tend to think that we have authority in our lives in more profound ways than we do. Well, I'm the boss, so I'm in charge at work. What I say goes. Well, I'm the parent, so what I say goes with my kids. Well, I'm an adult. No one can tell me what to do. For those of you guys that have watched Parks and Rec, we all think we're mini Ron Swansons. I have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. No one can take that from me. I'm in control. I'm the one that's in charge of that. But are we really? I mean, think about it just from a practical perspective. The number of things that could have gone wrong on your drive here this morning, and how little control you had over much of it. A puddle of water with just too much water in it could cause you to hydroplane. The car could have not started. Could have been a mechanical failure. Could have woken up ill. That would have kept you in bed. The ways in which we delude ourselves into thinking that we have authority and control in our lives, and the reality is all authority is in Jesus Christ. And here's the beautiful thing. When you think about the type of authority that's being used in this story, are the ones that we often exercise, what is the consistent theme amongst them? Self-preservation. Right? I exercise control as a parent to keep my house operating a certain way so that I can protect my kids from themselves, that I can protect them from others, that I can teach them how to grow up, that I can keep our home safe, right? All of these different things I might do, right? To give at least the illusion of safety and control. What is Pilate doing in this story? Everything he's doing, every decision he's making with the power that he has and the authority that he has is for self-preservation. Not to get too political, but look at our politicians. What are they likely really after? Their own ability to stay in power and get reelected. Because so often when we have the illusion of power or control or authority in our lives, what we use it for is for our own self-preservation. And yet, what is Jesus using it for? To head to the cross, to redeem the world from their sins. Guys, that's actually a power worth submitting to. So as Jesus tells Pilate this and he walks to the cross, he's revealed to us that he's the suffering servant, revealed to us from Isaiah 53. He reminds Pilate that he is in complete control and nothing that is going on here is taking him by surprise. And yet he continues to give in to this farce of a trial. And then lastly, we're going to see that Jesus is worthy of worship, but no one is going to choose to worship him. Look at John 19, verses 12 through 16. From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend." Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat on the judgment seat at a place called this place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. he said to the Jews, "Behold, your king." See, Pilate once again trying to make it clear, this is the guy you're worried about? They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. See, if Jesus actually has all authority and is truly the suffering servant as we've seen so far, then he's worthy of being worshiped, not crucified. And Pilate, clearly troubled, doesn't know what to do, and he seeks to release him, but the crowd will not allow it, and they yell this line out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So, the Jews at this point have played the final card in their hand. They are giving the appearance of being more loyal to Caesar than Pilate. Some historians believe that Pilate was friends with a guy by the name of Sejanus, who was a part of Pilate's inner circle. A part of the inner circle for Emperor Tiberius at this time. As a matter of fact, some historians will even say that Pilate got his position in this region from Sejanus, who kind of put his name in the ring to Emperor Tiberius. And at some point around AD 30, Tiberius got real angry with this guy and had him executed. And it would have been known all throughout the Roman world that this happened. And so what we're probably seeing here from the Jews is they're saying, "Hey, Pilate, remember your friend Sejanus? Remember how we thought he was a friend of Caesar, but he wasn't really a friend of Caesar? What happened to him?" "Oh, yeah. Tiberius had him killed. You're next if you don't take care of this." So Pilate caves. And he proceeds to pass the sentence of crucifixion. But what I want you to notice here as we finish up in this text this morning is the Jews who claim that Jesus had committed blasphemy are the ones that actually commit the final act of blasphemy. As he stands there pronouncing crucifixion over Jesus, he says, "Behold, your king. Shall I crucify your king?" And what did the chief priests say? "We have no king but Caesar." Now, theologically, this is a massive problem for them. Right? If you go back to 1 Samuel chapter 8, you are familiar with 1 Samuel at all, God's people are clamoring for a king. They want a king. We want to be like the other nations. We need a king. We need a king. And this is what God ends up saying. "And the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." Right? The promise in the Mosaic covenant was that God would be king of his people and he would be their God if they would obey. And if anyone in that crowd is supposed to know that, who would it have been? The chief priests. And yet as they bring Jesus to Pilate, claiming that he's worthy of death because of his blasphemy, they surrender and claim that they only serve Caesar. A pagan, Gentile king, the very thing they claim to hate, they give themselves over to. God is their king, but they deny him so that they can continue in their own way, living in self-righteousness and control. And so Pilate delivers him over to be crucified, and Jesus willingly goes. And this then leads us to what I want us to ponder this morning as we have seen these three things about Jesus. Is why in the world would Jesus endure all of this? I mean, the entire trial is a sham. It's built on lies. If you look at some of the other gospel accounts, it says when Jesus was tried at night, which, by the way, was illegal by Annas, that they couldn't even find two people to agree on testimony. He's willing to be beaten. This is the same man who walked on water, who raised Lazarus from the dead, who brought sight to the blind, who fed thousands off of 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Do you think there's nothing he can do in this situation? And yet he deals with the mockery of a trial, the beating, the scorn, the shame, the lies, even to the point of death. I want to finish by looking at Hebrews chapter 12, so that we can get a picture of why this suffering servant, this king who has full authority and is worthy of our worship, actually does this. Look at verse 2. Looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. There's a line in there that's really, really important. It says that Jesus was willing to endure the cross and despising the shame. Why? For the joy that was set before him. Well, what was that? It was the obedience to his Father, but it was also the redeeming of his own. Some of who were in that crowd that morning, who sent him to his death, the very ones who chose Caesar, their true king, willingly went to the cross to die for them. And so here's how I want to end our time this morning. I want to just ask you this question. And we're going to enter into a time of response because that's what we do here every week. And as we take some time to consider this text and ponder this story and ponder who is Jesus. Some of you in here this morning have been Christians for decades. Some of you in here this morning are here and you aren't even really sure why. I remember when my sister first started taking me to church when I was in college and I wasn't a believer. If somebody had asked me, why are you here? To make her shut up. If she will just stop bothering me, I will go. I will give her this hour. But the reality is this. We're all worshiping something. And if it's not Jesus, then it's Caesar. And I know what some of you are saying. Well, I don't struggle with worshiping kings or presidents or politicians. Like you, Kevin, I dislike all of them. Amen. But one, you might be a little bit more than you think. As a matter of fact, one of my biggest struggles is that I think I should be in those positions. Because surely I would do better. Surely I would rule more honestly and more justly. Surely it would be more equitable. Surely inflation would go down. But it doesn't have to be a king in that vein. Because really, all kings we worship at the end of the day are just idols. It can be the king of self-righteousness. Be the idol or king of sex, the idol of money, the idol of glory or celebrity. There's no end to the kings or idols we as mankind will try and worship. Whether it's self-righteous like the Sanhedrin, whether it's power and control and politics like Caesar, or whether it's national identity like the Jews. We all worship something. Know this. The true king worthy of your worship, Jesus Christ, willingly went to the cross and was crucified to save us from the false kings that we worship. And he rose from the dead 3 days later to liberate us from that slavery, to the very things we think will save us, and to save us from the penalty of death. If you think about the things that the Sanhedrin or the council or Pilate or the Jews struggle with here, they think that if they continue in their ways, that these things will promise them safety and control and security and acceptance. Only Jesus truly offers any of that. A testimony to God's faithfulness to his mission, which is to see the gospel
buried in the likeness of his death and raised to walk in newness of life.